All right, YouTube, here's the task for today. This is a 96 Ford F-350. This is what we're calling Project Frankenstroke. And one of the next things that we have to do to get this thing on its way is to replace some axle seals. See the oil leaking out of the knuckle here? That's an indicator that the internal oil seal that's supposed to contain the oil to the differential is leaking, and it's running down the tube here and dripping out. That is not a greasable U-joint. If it was, we would want to make sure that it's good, because that could also be grease just slung out of that U-joint. But the fact that it's not really there at the top so much as it is just at the bottom, it's kind of wet from here down, pretty good indicator that it's that axle seal leaking. So what we're going to do in this video is detail some of the tips and the tricks and the process to replacing those seals. So we'll go over how to disassemble the hub, how to remove the spindle, how to pull those axles, how to replace those seals, and then we'll go over reassembly. So if that's something that interests you, stay tuned. Let's get to work. Alright, well, we've got the wheel removed here. I took the lug nuts off using a 7/8 socket. So if you aren't sure of that size, this one's a dually, so they're a little bit different, but it's a 7/8 socket. Then we went ahead and removed the locking hub. This one has T25 Torx head screws in it. This one was kind of caked into place with some dirt and some mud that was kind of stuck in there. You probably saw me kind of struggling to figure out a way to get that loose, but anytime you can, use a little screwdriver, use a like an O-ring pick, use anything you can to get in there and clean as much of that dirt out as possible. A lot of times it's amazing how much that dirt will help to retain something that's stuck in place. So we went ahead and got those pulled, got that knocked loose. You saw me just trying to real gently tap on it. You try not to hit that thing too hard. It's just made of aluminum, so they're easier to break than they should be. And then once that's done, I've got a couple of screws in here just to help me kind of hang on to the locking hub, and you can see that there is a snap ring around the outside here that has to be removed. So this snap ring has got kind of a little recess in it. You can catch that with the tip of a screwdriver, pry it down this way and then out. So you can kind of get under it here. You can kind of maybe twist a little bit and work that thing loose, and then that snap ring can be removed and the hub should come right out. So there's our snap ring. And there's our locking hub. So a couple other little things I like to do. You see I've got a Cool Whip pail here. I just like to keep this stuff clean. It simplifies the process for kind of reassembling some things later if I don't have everything all completely trashed and dirty and full of leaves and gravel and dirt and everything else. So, especially greasy parts, bearings, these locking hubs, things like that, try to keep that stuff as clean as you can, and it'll save you some time cleaning things up when it comes time to reassemble it. So I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next step here. Kind of the one specialty tool that I do recommend that you have for doing this is a special socket. It's a spanner socket that loosens those axle nuts or spindle nuts here. So you can probably see what I'm talking about. It fits into these grooves here. See, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. You could probably reach in there with a punch or with a chisel and tap on it with a hammer, with a dually spindle like this one is. Ooh, dually Dana 60. It's a little harder to reach because it's a little deeper in there. The access is not quite as good as it is on a single rear wheel truck. So it is really nice to have the appropriate socket. Looks like that. So that just fits over top of that nut. Those little nubs fit into the slots in that nut, and you can turn that guy loose. This is not an expensive one. It's not a snap-on. This is OEM, which I think I purchased at Rock Auto, or no, I got this one at AutoZone. Part number 25966. It is a 1/2 inch drive, 4-lug internal, 76 by 80 millimeter lock nut socket. And you can see there that it is correct for Ford 3/4 and 1 tons from this era. So that guy fits in here just right, pops into place over top of that nut, and it allows us to remove that nut, remove the lock ring that is underneath it, remove the inner nut, and then we can take the spindle out. So I've got to get the caliper out of the way here. We'll get that taken off, and I'll bring you in here for a little bit closer shot so you can see what we're doing when we take that spindle apart. All right, so we've got the outer nut removed. You can see that inner, or that center locking ring, and I'll explain what that does here after I get it out. Essentially what this does is it locks the inner nut in place. This is kind of tricky trying to do this one-handed. You'll see what I mean here in a minute. So, see this tab? That fits into a groove on the top of the spindle here, and that keeps this from rotating. And then you've got all of these holes around the outside of this ring. See these? Those are what locks that inner nut. So if you can see, right there, right there, see that tab? That little pimple sticks into one of those holes, and it keeps that nut tight. These are not crazy tight, so you can't torque it down, otherwise you just seize up that bearing. So to keep the proper tension and preload on that bearing, and to keep that nut from moving, that lock ring is used. So you remove the outer nut, which basically is torqued down pretty tight and holds this ring into place, and that keeps that inner nut from backing off. Make sense? Good. All right, let's get that inner nut off of there. We'll get the caliper and the caliper bracket out of the way, and we'll get on to the next step in the process, which will be removing the spindle. Alright, so we are down to what's called the spindle, which is this piece here. This is what the bearings all ride on. This is actually what supports the truck. It's bolted to what's called the knuckle, this piece here, through the ball joints and onto the axle tube itself. So we've got everything taken apart here. I removed the caliper and the caliper bracket using a 21 millimeter socket and my big breaker bar. That may be a standard size bolt, but I'll be honest, there's such a hodgepodge of metric and standard size fasteners used on these trucks. I usually just grab my metric stuff. It seems to work just fine for me. So there are a couple of different ways that we can go about removing this spindle. One is that there's a tool that threads on here in place of those nuts and fits in the end of a slide hammer and allows you to pull that spindle out. This is actually recessed back into the knuckle here by about 1/4 of an inch. And sometimes they can be a real booger to get pulled. I'm going to try and do it without that tool for a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't have one. I can run down and rent one from AutoZone if I need to. I do have a slide hammer, so I may end up having to go that route. The other thing is, sometimes not everybody has these tools at their disposal, so I try to show the methods that are most likely to suit people that don't have a lot of money, I guess, invested in their hand tools. The other thing that you can do to try and separate these is right here where the part line is on these pieces. You can get in here with a good sharp chisel and really wail on it with the biggest hammer you can swing. And a lot of times that will help to break this loose. However, this one looks pretty crusty, so I'm not sure if that's going to work. We've actually got a little bit of a gap back in here where that dust shield isn't in the crack there. So we might be able to get our chisel in there and get this thing separated. So that's kind of the next step, is to see if we can get that pulled apart, and then everything kind of comes out this side. So let's get to work on that. We'll see if we can get this spindle pulled on this side. Success. You're able to get this thing pulled apart without the use of that specialized tool. You can see all of the grease and oil on this shaft, so our assumption that this seal was leaking was correct. Anyway, we got the spindle off. Again, kind of terminology if you're concerned about that. Knuckle, spindle, dust shield, and then of course this is your outer axle, outer shaft, inner shaft. These are both on the driver's side, and then of course we've got a U-joint there in the center. U-joint on this one seems to be nice and tight. There's no slop in it. It looks like all the seals are in place, so we don't need to worry about replacing that guy right now. We've got this side done. So at this point, a couple of things of note. If I hadn't already done so, this would be the perfect time to take this, what am I trying to say? This would be the perfect time to take this tie rod loose from the knuckle. And the reason for that is we've got to get into that cover. And we can get the cover off, but we cannot get the carrier out of the inside of that differential with the tie rod in place. So I've done that already. Basically what you would do on that is loosen off this nut that's on the top. I like to leave them, come on, focus, with just a couple of threads holding it, and then to separate it from the knuckle. And the tip on that is, don't beat on this. You'll screw up the nut, you'll screw up the threads. If you can avoid it, just leave that guy alone. So the best way to separate these is to get some pressure in here. Come on, focus. Get some pressure right across this area here. So what I do is I get a great big pry bar in there, I put some good solid pressure on it, and then with the BFH there, nail this knuckle right here as hard as you can. The shock that's transmitted back through here will allow that to separate as you're pushing down on it with your leverage. These tie rod ends are tapered, so this end of the hole is larger than this end of the hole, and the nut basically just retains it in there. That keeps everything tight. So it wants to go that way anyway. That's the way that it gets loosest. So as you put some pressure on there, you put some leverage in here, nail that guy with a big hammer. The shock and vibration that it sends back through here will knock that guy loose. And at that point, all we've got to do is just take that nut off, drop this guy out of the way, and we're ready to either move on to taking the cover off the middle or onto the other side. Taking the cover off is pretty self-explanatory. You've got a whole bunch of 9/16 head bolts that go all the way around the outside. Put yourself a catch pan underneath there because the oil comes pouring out as soon as that cover comes loose. So you'll just back all those nuts off, or those bolts off. I've actually got this thing pulled apart already. I opened it up just to see what the gears look like. If you're interested in seeing that, you can take a look at that on one of the other Frankenstroke project videos, where I've got that opened up as we prepared this axle for installation in this truck. This was a job that wasn't necessarily easily done on the floor of the shop. It's just about as easy to do this with the axle in the truck. It's not flopping around and trying to fall over this way, so I just decided to wait until it was in place to replace these seals. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and knock this tie rod loose. I'll move everything around to the other side. We'll get that side taken apart the same way we did this side, and then we'll bring you back in here so we can show the process of pulling the carrier out of the differential. Well, the wind is picking up a little bit out here. Hopefully the wind noise isn't too bad and you can hear me. So we've got the cover pulled off. Those are 9/16 or 14mm bolts all the way around the extreme outside. Then you can remove that. A lot of times I will get a sharp chisel again, or I guess you could use a screwdriver if you don't have a chisel, in between the face of the axle itself and the cover, and drive it in, and that begins it peeling apart. Usually these are just sealed with silicone. Once that's done, you can do that in a couple of places and then just kind of peel that guy off of there. Loosen up your 4 bearing cap bolts. These are 19mm. They're not 3/4, they're 19mm. Take those 4 loose, and then you can remove the bearing caps like such. Now, once these are removed, you're ready to remove the differential. Now, I like to keep things laid out here so I know how it came apart and how it goes back together. So I'll keep them turned the proper direction, keep them on separate sides. Just kind of helps speed things up as we go back together. Now, a couple of notes about this. Number one, this thing is not just going to slide right out. It is wedged in place there pretty tight, and basically what it's sandwiched in between this face and that face, and it's in there tight because the tension is what sets the preload on these bearings. It's a cone bearing, so in order for everything to stay tight, it has to stay compressed together this way. So to get this guy out, the best way that I have found is to roll a rag up into it. And essentially what I'm going to do is we'll take my rag here, and we're going to roll it down in through the gears of the teeth, or through the teeth of the gears, right back in there between the ring and the pinion, and that should begin forcing it out. So once we get that thing started, we'll be able to get in here with a pry bar and just roll this case, or the carrier, over and spin it loose, and then we can pull it out. Now the other thing to note is, be ready. Once this thing comes out, it is heavy. That's a big chunk of cast iron with big heavy gears on it. So that guy is going to fall if you're not ready to catch him. If you doubt your ability to catch it, maybe put some wood or something down on the ground underneath there so that that thing doesn't come crashing down onto your concrete and damage the gears or mash fingers or whatever. So at this point, I think we're about ready to roll this guy out of here. Alright guys, well we've got our chunk. We've got the differential pulled. This one came out without too much trouble. We were able to roll that rag up in there between the teeth of the gear and push it right out. This is what I was talking about with those bearings. See how this is a conical bearing, meaning that it's cone shaped? Can you see that? The way that you set how tight these bearings are is by how tightly pressed together they are this way. That's why it's kind of wedged into place in the carrier there. And that's why you can't just pull it out by hand. Now this one is done a little bit differently than some. This one has the shims mounted down inside here. And the shim adjusts a preload here as well as setting the lash on these gear teeth, which would be the relationship between these teeth and the teeth of the pinion that's spinning in here. So that's all set using shims that are installed here. It moves this carrier back and forth until those teeth line up the way that they should to mate properly. So some trucks, those shims will be on the outside here. Those will be on the outside of the bearings here. They'll be in between here and the faces of that bearing face. If that is the case on your truck, don't mix those shims up. They may be different thicknesses from side to side. In fact, they probably are. And if you mix those up, then you're going to mess up the preload on those gear teeth. So if those shims come out, make sure you know which side they go on. Make sure that you get them back in the same side that you took them out of. But at this point, we're in. So we're able now to get to those seals. We can remove those old ones, and I'll show you how to install the new ones. Alright, well, I've hit a snag. This happens sometimes. So you can see my old seals here. This is actually kind of a two-part design. And I've got my new seals here that I ordered. Nice Spicer Dana parts. Part number 50381. Anybody else see an issue here? So these are not gonna do it. They won't even fit. They're the wrong seals. So I've got the other ones on order. They'll be here in a couple of days, but unfortunately it looks like I'm through for today. So I'm just gonna go ahead and take those bearing caps. I'll just put them loosely in place back in there. I'll go ahead and close that cover up so we don't fill it up with leaves and dirt and dust and debris and birds and who knows what else. So I'll get that part closed up. I'll probably just stuff a rag in either end of the axle, keep anything from going in that end. And I guess we'll put all this mess away and try again another day. It's just the way it goes sometimes.